Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Up in Smoke Part 3. Today we're going to be talking about the unsolved mystery of Susan Powell. When we last left off, we had talked about how Joshua Powell would meet Susan Cox at a Mormon ward meeting at his house. They would begin dating and eventually get married. And after they would get married for a brief period of time, they would move in with Joshua's father, Stephen Powell. And this would just be a very uncomfortable situation, as he would become very obsessively infatuated with Susan and would take a lot of unsolicited pictures and videos of Susan without her knowing. And a lot of these times she would be in a state of undress in her bedroom, or she would be trying to use the bathroom. And a lot of these times, not only taking these videos, he would also record himself as a journal and would constantly talk about how he was so aroused by Susan and that she was completely perfect in his eyes. And he just had this delusion that Susan was just as infatuated with him as he was about her. And he wouldn't just stop at taking pictures, and a lot of these pictures would focus on very intimate parts of her body. And not only would he do these pictures, he would also collect personal things of Susan's, like her garments, underwear, even her nail clippings and her feminine products. And might I add, used feminine products. He would constantly write in a journal about sexual fantasies that he had about Susan. And this eventually would build up to about 2003, when he would confess his undying love for Susan. And Susan would completely turn him down and would tell him that she had no sexual feelings towards him whatsoever, and would say that you're my father-in-law and I'm married to your son. I'm basically a step down from your own children. She would even go and tell Stephen, my own father doesn't even kiss me, and you've kissed me, and it makes me completely uncomfortable. And in that particular video, you could just hear just how awkward and uncomfortable Susan was. And it was after this conversation that Susan would go to Joshua and completely tell him everything that had been going on and what his father had said. And as a way to put distance between the two and getting away from that situation, they would move to Utah. And she would think that this would make things better, but it wouldn't, because Stephen would constantly write Susan through the mail and would constantly ask her on dates or ask her to go on vacations, which she would tell him no every single time. And if that wasn't bad enough, she would start receiving nude photographs from Stephen. And it wasn't long after this that she would start trying to avoid any conversations with Stephen whatsoever, and would actually tell friends and family that she got a vibe or a feeling that Stephen was a P word. And pay attention to this, because this will have a big part to play later on down the road. And eventually, Joshua and his father Stephen would get back into contact, but while they weren't talking, things actually started looking good for Susan and Joshua. Joshua and Susan would give birth to their first son, Charles Powell, on January 19th, 2005. And then later give birth to Brayden Powell on January 2nd, 2007. And from the outside looking in, it would seem that Susan and Joshua would have a really good relationship. But looks can be very deceiving. But a lot of family and friends would say that they just had the perfect marriage. They were constantly taking pictures together and just doing things as a family. And financially speaking, both Joshua and Susan did pretty well for themselves, looking on the outside. Joshua was actually, during this time, a computer programmer, and he would work various different jobs as a computer programmer that was behind, like, creating logos for different company. And Susan had a very consistent job as a stockbroker, but she did have training as a cosmetologist, which she did very well with. Unfortunately, by 2008 is right around the time that people would start noticing that there would seem to be trouble in paradise as Joshua and Susan started having a lot of problems. And it's around this time that Susan started going to people about certain problems that her and Joshua were having. Most of this is because Joshua would start getting in contact with his father, and Stephen would just give him these elaborate and crazy opinions and theories that Joshua would just start going with. And this was starting to put a lot of friction between Joshua and Susan's marriage. What I find most unsettling is that Joshua would just completely forgive his father for everything he had tried with Susan and would just talk to him as if nothing had happened. And I'm just kind of puzzled by the fact that Joshua would just listen to any marital advice Stephen would give him, knowing good and well that he was completely infatuated and obsessed with his wife, and didn't think for 1 second that possibly Stephen could be trying to create problems between himself and Susan so that they could split up and get divorced, so that in Stephen's delusional mind, he could move in and be with Susan. It's around this time that Joshua started distancing himself from the Mormon church, which was very unsettling for Susan because that's where she found her husband. And a lot of these radical opinions that Stephen was filling in Joshua's head would more than anything be about the Mormon church. And that was one of the more unsettling things that made Susan very frazzled, was because she just felt like she was losing her husband. Susan Powell's sister, Denise Cox, would later say in an interview that around this time is the time that she started noticing a difference in Joshua's demeanor, as a lot of times he would not hold Susan's hand or be affectionate. And this was the first time in years after their 8-year marriage that he started changing for the worse. And it wasn't until later on that Susan began telling her sister that not only that, but he was repeating what his father had done as trying to teach his boys to be rude and disrespectful to her, just as Stephen had done with him and his siblings. It's also around this time that Joshua became more rude, disrespectful, and domineering over Susan, and was becoming growingly more and more possessive over Susan. Now, I'm not sure if there was physical abuse during this time, but as we will later find out, that Susan was in a constant state of fear all the time around Joshua at this point in time. And between June and October of 2008, Susan started going to not just family and friends, but even members of her church to see what she could do about her marital problems. Susan and Joshua would also begin taking marriage counseling, but it really didn't help their marriage at all. And by 2008, Susan and Joshua's marriage was pretty much on the rocks. By December 6, 2008, Joshua and Susan would have been married for over 8 years, which is a very long time for newlyweds, and at this point in time, their marriage was on the rocks. But on this particular day, which would fall on a Sunday, Joshua and Susan would actually invite some friends over for a dinner. Now, what would throw the friends off when they arrived is that when they would arrive at the house, they would notice that Joshua would be fixing the dinner, and he would actually be fixing pancakes. But this actually would become very suspicious later on down the road. The friends would say that later on in the evening, Susan would actually become very nauseous and sick and would actually go up to their bedroom to lay down. Other than Joshua cooking, nothing else seemed out of pocket, and they wouldn't notice something wrong until that following Monday.